But we are covering Isaiah 7 through 12 today. We were a little ambitious last week in assigning that homework out 2 weeks ago, so we're covering it now. So we're going to cover Isaiah 7 through 12. I'm going to give you just a second to log in. When I stop seeing phones, I will stop stalling for time. The code will also be at the top of the screen for those of you with 2015 vision. But we're moving on. All right, we're going to start with questions for investigation. Questions for investigation. Ahaz asks the Lord for a sign to confirm Isaiah's prophecy. True or false? How many people do we have? I'm going for like 8. 8 responses, and then we'll send it. True or false? All right. A pure 50-50. That's incredible. One more person says true than false. We will find out very shortly. Second, Emmanuel means God is my judge, God with us, God of wonder, the Lord is just. What does Emmanuel mean? Maybe everybody knows this one. Oh, goodness. Okay. I got taught that one in Sunday school. Is it a Christmas thing? Okay. There are lots of Christmas things that I still don't remember, though. Last question for tonight. The primary covenant that Isaiah seems to draw on in our passage, 7 through 12, is which covenant? The Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, or the Davidic covenant? So the covenant with Noah, with Abraham, with Moses, or with David. Which one is the primary inspiration for Isaiah in this passage? That is totally fine. That's legal. I don't know. Well, we'll count it in the stats for a success later. All right. 40% say the Davidic covenant, but at least one person voted for every other answer. So pretty big spread. All right. We will get the answer to that one as well. The topic, unsurprisingly, is the book of Isaiah, chapters 7 through 12. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this down into small little subsections. We're not going to go verse by verse through all 5 chapters. I'm just going to kind of hit some highlights and talk about the setting of the prophecies, some prophetic highlights we can take from it, and if there are any sort of interpretive issues or debates that we need to bring out, I'll bring those out. Now, for those of you who have already read these chapters, they are, I will say, highly messianic. They are very focused on Jesus. Some of these passages will be extremely familiar to you, even if you didn't read them for the homework. And so we're going to kind of talk about some of the messianic portions of those prophecies more heavily, because those are the ones that are the most relevant to us. But we'll talk a little bit about the immediate context. So I have labeled this first block, which goes from Isaiah 7, verses 1 through 17, as the child to come. There's a very familiar prophecy about a child that's going to be born. And the setting for this, it's during the reign of Ahaz. So Ahaz was the king of Judah at the time, which is the southern tribes. It's where Jerusalem was. And Ahaz is in the Davidic line. So he is a king from the house of David. And the kings of Syria and the king of Israel, which is the northern tribes, or Ephraim, so the king of the northern tribes, they decide to go out for battle against Jerusalem, because they want Ahaz to join their forces against Assyria. So there's a lot of geopolitical maneuvering going on here, but they're going to kind of lean on the southern tribes. And they're unsuccessful. This is like historical context we get at the beginning of this passage. They are not successful in destroying the southern tribes or getting them to bow to their wishes. And Isaiah is sent out to tell Ahaz, hey, stay calm. And I know you've got these 2 enemies in Syria and Ephraim, but don't trust the Assyrians and don't rely on the Assyrians for your safety. You need to rely on the Lord. And we know from reading the rest of the passage that Ahaz and the people are not going to listen to this warning. So the highlights that come from this passage of prophecy, these first 17 verses, are first of all that the Syrian king and the king of Ephraim, or the northern tribes, they're not going to conquer Judah. And in fact, Isaiah prophesies that Ephraim, the northern tribes, will no longer exist within 65 years. Within 65 years, they're going to be completely gone. And as a part of bolstering Ahaz's confidence in this prophecy and to help him in trusting the Lord actually tells Ahaz, ask me for a sign. I will give you a sign to confirm this prophecy. Ask me. It can even be something miraculous, he says. And oddly enough, Ahaz refuses. He says he doesn't want to put the Lord to the test. And God actually rebukes Ahaz for refusing to ask for a sign and gives him a sign anyway. And this is where we get this passage that there's a young woman who will conceive, or a virgin who will conceive and give birth to a son who will be called Emmanuel. And before that child is old enough to choose between good and evil, the lands of these opposing kings will be desolate. They'll be destroyed. So Ahaz is the current head of David's household, and the key to surviving this attack from Syria and Ephraim is just simply that the Lord has declared it. He's declared they're safe, and the key is for him to trust in that. And standing firm as a people is going to require them standing firm on the promises of God. And we can see the kind of central part of this sign in verses 14 through 16, where Isaiah says this, "For this reason the Lord himself will give you a confirming sign. Look, this young woman is about to conceive and will give birth to a son. You, young woman, will name him Emmanuel. He will eat sour milk and honey, which will help him know how to reject evil and choose what is right. Here is why this will be so. Before the child knows how to reject evil and choose what is right, the land whose two kings you fear will be desolate." So there are some interpretive challenges with these verses. One of them, as you will notice, is that the word that's used for virgin in the Christmas readings doesn't always or only mean virgin. It can mean young woman, and in fact, in many cases, it does. So there is debate about whether this is specifically referring to a virgin birth or whether it's referring to a birth from a young woman. Now, we know from it being quoted in the New Testament that it's at least referring to the birth of Jesus. We'll see that coming up in Matthew. Matthew specifically says that Jesus' birth is the fulfillment of this prophecy. But there are sometimes double fulfillments of prophecies in scriptures, where there's a short-term fulfillment that partially fulfills the prophecy, and there's a longer-term fulfillment that more perfectly or more completely fulfills it. And that's not uncommon when we're talking about these prophecies relating to the deliverance of Israel, or to a king that is coming, or to a deliverer, because there were, throughout the course of Israel's history, some good kings and some deliverers and some people who functioned in a way that was to save them from a specific circumstance, but not the final or the complete salvation, which would come in the Messiah. So there's often a sense of, yes, there's a partial salvation now in the physical sense, or there's a partial restoration now, but there will be an additional one in the future that will be more perfect and more complete. So because we have this passage in Matthew, we have Matthew 1, 21 through 23, the angel says, "She will give birth to a son, and you will name him Jesus." He's talking to Joseph, "because he will save his people from their sins. This all happened so that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet would be fulfilled. Look, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will name him Emmanuel," which means God with us. So, at a minimum, this passage is referring to Jesus. But a question remains of whether this Isaiah prophecy is also referring to some child that would be born in the short term. And I think there's good reason to think that there is. First of all, it's not obvious that the Lord is offering a sign to Ahaz to prove the reliability of the prophecy. And it's not super clear how the birth of the Messiah hundreds of years later would be an encouraging sign for him. Now, there are people who make arguments that kind of, can counteract that and stuff, who think that this is exclusively a prophecy about Jesus, that there's no short-term fulfillment necessary. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really make that much difference theologically, because the point is, it's at least talking about Jesus. It's not less than that. There's probably, in my opinion, additional meaning, because there are some candidates for a child that could be born in the near future. There's Hezekiah, who is one of the good kings of Israel, who's going to bring a lot of restoration. And there's also Isaiah's son. One of Isaiah's sons is born, and his birth is described in the very next chapter. And it's possible that that is part of the sign as well. That what is being referenced is not that the child in the short term will be the deliverer, but simply that the sheer speed with which these enemies will be defeated is kind of encapsulated in Isaiah's prophetic utterance of, hey, before this child's going to be born, and this is going to happen so fast that before the child even grows up and knows the difference between right and wrong, these kingdoms will be gone. They'll be destroyed. So I think there probably is a short-term or a near-term fulfillment to this prophecy, but it's not fully fulfilled until we get to Jesus, and we know that from Matthew. And the fact that these things are debated and that there are people who disagree about some of these interpretations shouldn't be scary or cause any doubt. The New Testament makes a huge number of references to the way that Jesus fulfilled prophecy, but it doesn't argue from the fulfilled prophecies to the conclusion that Jesus is Lord. The fulfilled prophecies are supplementary evidence. They saw the resurrected Jesus, and because he was resurrected, they said, he was right. Everything he said was true. He's been vindicated by Yahweh. The Father has raised him from the dead. He is Lord. And then we have the Emmaus Road, right, where Jesus explains and says, hey, it's all been about me the whole time. And they're like, oh my goodness, it was there. But they weren't sitting around pulling all these hundreds of prophecies out of Scripture and saying, well, because, Yeshua of Joseph and Mary fulfilled these 500 prophecies, therefore he's the Lord. They already knew he was the Lord. And then they could go back and say, well, and he also fulfills all these prophecies, so we're doubly sure. There's extra no reason to doubt. Does that make sense? Okay. So in Isaiah, the next section we're going to look through is Isaiah 7:18 through 9:1. And I've just labeled this Isaiah and his sons. There's some things that are interesting for people who find themselves with prophetic gifts. Isaiah describes him and his sons as an object lesson, which is interesting. But in this passage, he's talking about, if Ahaz and the people don't listen, God will send the Assyrians against them. So there's some irony here, right? The reason they wouldn't listen to the Lord is if they're trusting in the safety of these other nations. And he's saying, if you don't trust me, I'm going to let these other nations do you harm. And it also concentrates on Isaiah and his prophetic ministry, that Isaiah must rely on the Lord, that he and his sons are object lessons for the people of Israel. And he's even called to give his son a prophetic name. And we're going to look at that here in Isaiah 8:3 through 4. Isaiah says, I then approached the prophetess for marital relations. That's his wife, by the way. She conceived and gave birth to a son. The Lord told me, name him Maher Shalal Hashbaz. For before the child knows how to cry out, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the plunder of Samaria will be carried off by the king of Assyria. Now you may notice that the language that's used there is shockingly similar to the language that's used in the prophecy immediately before, the one that we know is at least about Jesus. And that's part of the reason that some people think that Isaiah's son might be a short-term fulfillment of the prophecy, is that it says, before he knows how to cry out, my father and my mother, which is very similar to saying before he's grown, before he knows the difference between good and evil, what will happen? These two enemies of Israel will be destroyed. which is exactly what was supposed to happen as part of the sign in the previous passage. So there's a chance. Now you might wonder, well, he's got a name here, and it's not Emmanuel. Well, people had multiple names, so it's possible. I'm not saying that I necessarily think it has to be that, but it's possible. And I think that's one of the reasons that some people believe that there's a short-term fulfillment of this prophecy and that it might be Isaiah's son. But this name literally translates to quickly the plunder, it hurries the loot. Or more fleshed out, one hastens to the plunder, one hurries to the loot. And so it seems as though this is a name of warning as part of the object lesson of the looting and the plundering is hastening. It's coming. It's on the doorstep if you don't trust in the Lord. Our next section is Isaiah 9:1 through 10:4. And I've labeled this section a messianic ruler because it's all about the coming of a very particular type of ruler. It's looking forward to a future fulfillment of restoration by God. And in this passage, it's pretty clear that this is looking towards a future time, that it's not in the present and it's not in the now. But the way the literal language that's used is as though Isaiah is already there. He's talking about what he sees in the present. It's as though his prophetic perspective has been thrown forward in time. So when we read language that's talking about the present, that's as though he were in the present. Does that make sense? It's kind of like if someone says, on that day, I will be seeing such and such, and I am doing such and such, and there are people coming to me. Well, we already know from the framing statement that it's not present from the time he's speaking. It's a literary perspective. Does that make sense? So anyway, it's looking forward to a future fulfillment. Some people, there are some messianic names here. We're going to look at them in Isaiah 9 through 6-7. So this is where we get the sort of famous Christmas verses, right? For a child has been born to us, a son has been given to us. He shoulders responsibility and is called Wonderful Advisor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His dominion will be vast, and he will bring immeasurable prosperity. He will rule on David's throne and over David's kingdom, establishing it and strengthening it by promoting justice and fairness from this time forward and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of heaven's armies will accomplish it. Now, it's the most traditional interpretation of this passage is that it's referring to Jesus, and I agree with that. There are some commentators who argue that these names, Wonderful Advisor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, that those are actually describing Yahweh, and that it would be better to translate this name as God is a wonderful advisor, he is the mighty God, he is the everlasting Father, he is the Prince of Peace, in a similar way to Emmanuel means God is with us, right? I don't find that overly persuasive, and it's a minority interpretation in most translations. But some people think that Isaiah is referring to a short-term ruler of Judah, like perhaps Hezekiah. It's possible, but again, the full fulfillment of this is clearly the Messiah with a capital M. It's Jesus, because the description in verse 7 doesn't line up with any of the Davidic kings. So the dominion that he's going to have, immeasurable prosperity, he will establish and strengthen the throne, promoting justice and fairness from this time forward and forevermore. There were some bad kings after Hezekiah, and then there was some going into exile after Hezekiah, right? That can't be just another king in the Davidic line. So again, we have a prophecy that at least refers to Jesus. Now, there may have been some small partial payoffs of this throughout the history of Israel subsequent to Isaiah's prophesying it, but the full fulfillment is really in Christ. And so the main point is that Isaiah is emphasizing that God will keep his promises to David and to the Davidic line. And we're going to come back to that idea of the promises that the Lord made to David when we go to our second look. The next section we have here is Isaiah 10, 5 through 32, which I just called Assyria, the Lord's tool. And the main point is just that the Lord is using Assyria for judgment on Israel. Assyria is prideful, and they're boasting of what they have accomplished. They're not recognizing that it's the Lord who's allowed them to have these victories. And because of that pridefulness and their lack of recognition, the Lord is going to destroy them. And there's a key insight here, which is that God can use someone's bad motives for his purposes. That is within his right, and it still maintains his justice to use someone's bad motives for his purposes. And he can still justly condemn them because it's their motives. They're the ones who willed evil in their hearts. The Lord is perfectly capable of taking those things and using them to bring about something he wants to accomplish, but still condemning them for the moral evil that it is. And this passage also includes an affirmation that regardless of the fact that Assyria is going to come in and destroy, there will be a remnant of Judah that will be preserved. So again, we have this core prophetic concept that we'll see over and over of a remnant being saved. And the last major section is Isaiah 10:33 through 12:6, which the whole purpose of this portion is to describe the new David. David's dynasty will fall or be cut down. That's what starts this whole chain of thought. There's going to be an axe taken to the trees, but a new Davidic king will come from Jesse's line. That's what Isaiah says. He says this in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. He says, "A shoot will grow out of Jesse's rootstock. A bud will sprout from his roots. The Lord's Spirit will rest on him, a spirit that gives extraordinary wisdom, a spirit that provides the ability to execute plans, a spirit that produces absolute loyalty to the Lord. He will take delight in obeying the Lord. He will not judge by mere appearances or make decisions on the basis of hearsay. He will treat the poor fairly and make right decisions for the downtrodden of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and order the wicked to be executed. Justice will be like a belt around his waist. Integrity will be like a belt around his hips. A wolf will reside with a lamb, and a leopard will lie down with a young goat. An ox and a young lion will graze together, and a small child leads them along. A cow and a bear will graze together. Their young will lie down together. A lion, like an ox, will eat straw. A baby will play over the hole of a snake, over the nest of a serpent. An infant will put his hand. They will no longer injure or destroy on my entire royal mountain, for there will be universal submission to the Lord's sovereignty, just as the waters completely cover the sea." There's no realistic interpretation of that other than to the reign and dominion of Jesus. And it's interesting because the reference to Jesse, rather than to the house of David, seems to be calling attention to the fact that this won't be just another Davidic king. It's not just going to be someone in the line of David. We're going back to Jesse, who's David's father, and saying, from the root of Jesse, something new will come, which brings up this imagery of it's like a new David. It's like a new David that's going to be established. And we have parallels for that because there's the first Adam and the last Adam, right? There's the original David, or the human David, and then there's the God-man David, right? A new Davidic king, not in the same mold as the previous Davidic kings who had so often failed Israel, but still from the line and house of David, from the root of Jesse. And this king will embody all the holiness, all the faithfulness, and all the justice that had been lacking from that line so many times. And he'll restore his people. And part of the reason we know this is a reference to Christ's ultimate reign is it even says he will bring back Ephraim from dispersion, from the exile, and restore Ephraim and Judah to unity. So the 12 tribes will be restored in full unity. So, that brings us to our exercise for tonight. We're going to go back to this passage on Assyria. When discussing Assyria, Isaiah makes it clear that Assyria is useful to the Lord, but not pleasing to the Lord. He describes Assyria almost as an axe in the Lord's hands, right? And Gabriel has preached on this before about would you rather be pleasing to the Lord or useful to the Lord? And he makes this distinction, and I find it super helpful because the right answer is pleasing, because there are so many examples like this in Scripture of persons or nations or groups that were useful to the Lord, but were not pleasing to him and who ultimately go to condemnation. So, group up in groups of 5 or 6, and then talk amongst yourselves. Can you think of other biblical examples of persons or nations or groups that were useful to the Lord, but were not pleasing to him? And once you have some of those examples in mind or written down, how were they displeasing to the Lord? And how did the Lord use them either in spite of or in some cases because of their sinful motives? Please discuss. All right, do we have thoughts? What are some examples? Samson. Ooh, that's a good one. Yes. Very useful to the Lord. Not overly pleasing. Tiny bit of redemption at the end, but not a great story. Pharaoh. Yes. Very true. Babylon. Good one as well. Yes. David did face the lion and the bear. He probably more pleasing to the Lord on balance, but he did do some important stuff. Yes, it's true. Oh, the lion. The lion itself is the thing that wasn't pleasing. I don't know. It's interesting. Other thoughts? Judas, yeah. Signature one. What'd you say? Israel. Yeah. Yeah, pretty routinely. Joseph's brothers, that's a good one. I mean, Joseph explicitly says, like, what you intended for evil, the Lord meant for good. Solomon, yeah. It's actually a pretty common pattern, which is interesting. It's disturbing. Yes, the Lord can use almost anything, it seems like. Even Satan, yeah. There's an old quote from Luther that Satan is the Lord's devil, which I think he's just trying to rile people up with framing it that way. But there's a grain of theological truth in there, which is that he can use all of those things to bring about his purposes. Oh, yeah. We'd all be Catholics. All right. Well, not everything about the Lord is in the Bible. The Davidic covenant is going to be our second look. The Davidic covenant is, in my opinion, the primary inspiration that Isaiah draws on for his prophecies in 7 through 12. Now, there are lots of other things he draws on, but we're going to see references to the Davidic covenant over and over and over again. So we want to look at where the covenant is made with David. And we see this referenced in 2 Samuel 7, 8 through 16. So now say this to my servant David. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies has said. I took you from the pasture and from your work as a shepherd to make you leader of my people Israel. I was with you wherever you went, and I defeated all your enemies before you. Now I will make you as famous as the great men of the earth. I will establish a place for my people Israel and settle them there. They will live there and not be disturbed anymore. Violent men will not oppress them again as they did in the beginning, and during the time when I appointed judges to lead my people Israel. Instead, I will give you relief from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that he himself will build a dynastic house for you. When the time comes for you to die, I will raise up your descendant, one of your own sons, to succeed you, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will make his dynasty permanent. I will become his father, and he will become my son. When he sins, I will correct him with the rod of men and with wounds inflicted by human beings. But my loyal love will not be removed from him, as I removed it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will stand before me permanently. Your dynasty will be permanent. There are a couple of things that should jump out at us from this declaration of this covenant. The first is that it's permanent. It's stated several times. It's a permanent covenant. And not only is the covenant permanent, but the dynasty that it promises will be permanent. And there are no conditions given. When we looked a couple weeks ago at the Mosaic covenant, the covenant that the Lord makes with the people of Israel through Moses, and there are a lot of conditions in that covenant. And it says, you need to be obedient, and if you don't, here are the punishments that are going to be meted out. But if you are obedient, here are the blessings. So the blessings were conditional on the people maintaining faithfulness within the covenant If they weren't faithful, they were not individually going to receive those blessings. There are no such conditions given in the promises to David. From what we can tell, the Davidic covenant is something the Lord has promised he's going to do regardless of what humans do. That's remarkable. That is almost unprecedented in Scripture, that the Lord is going to make David this promise for the permanency of his line and his dynasty. And the reason that we think that this is Isaiah's primary covenant that he's referencing in this passage of 7 through 12 is because there are two key themes that overlap with Isaiah. And the first of those is references to the line of David. References to the line of David are all over in the passages that we've just covered. Particularly, we'll pull out one from chapter 7, verse 2. It describes the prophecy that Isaiah is giving not as being reported to Ahaz. It does in other places reference Ahaz by name, but it describes this as being reported to the family of David. It's highlighting not just Ahaz the king, not just Ahaz the king of Judah, the family of David, the Davidic line. It's like, hey, remember who you are. You're from the line of David. There's something permanent about that dynasty. Verse 7:13, pay attention, family of David. He's reminding them, you're from the Davidic line. That should ring bells in your head. Verse 11:1, a shoot from Jesse, the new David that's going to come. The messianic prophecy is going to be a shoot from Jesse. And 11:10, a root from Jesse. So over and over again, there are these references to specifically David's family, calling attention to their position within the Lord's purposes and the promises that he's made to David's family, David's line. So that's one key sort of reference that's woven through all of these prophecies that Isaiah is making. And there's a second theme, which is the Lord of heaven's armies. In the prophecy that the prophecy in 2 Samuel, it starts out with saying, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies has said. That is not a super uncommon theme or name for the Lord, but it is one that is particularly associated with David, which we'll see in a minute. But here are all the references to it in Isaiah. The passages we just read, there are references obviously in the rest of the book of Isaiah. You must recognize the authority of the Lord of heaven's armies, verses 8:13. 8:18, the reminders are being sent from the Lord of heaven's armies. 9:13, they did not seek reconciliation with the Lord of heaven's armies. 9:19, the anger of the Lord of heaven's armies, because of it, the land was scorched. 10:16, 10:23, 10:24, over and over and over again. I'm not going to read them all, but it keeps referring to Yahweh as the Lord of heaven's armies, the Lord of heaven's armies, the Lord of heaven's armies. And then we get chapter 9, verse 7, right in the heart of this beautiful passage about the Messiah to come. It says this, his dominion will be vast, he will bring immeasurable prosperity, he will rule on David's throne, highlighting the Davidic throne, calling back to the promises to David, and over David's kingdom, establishing it and strengthening it by promoting justice and fairness from this time forward and forevermore. Who's going to accomplish it? The zeal of the Lord of heaven's armies will accomplish it. Those two themes come together at the high point of the messianic prophecies at the center of this passage, right here in the middle of chapter 9. David's throne and the Lord of heaven's armies, which are the two things that form the core concepts in the Davidic covenant. And this name appears all throughout other prophets. It appears in Psalms, and it appears in other places in the historical books, 1st and 2nd Samuel. But it is frequently associated with David, because it's a military name for the Lord, and David was a military king. We see even David himself specifically using this when he goes out to fight Goliath. It says in 1 Samuel 17:45, but David replied to the Philistine, you are coming against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I am coming against you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel's armies, who you have defied. And we even see David using this name in prayer in 2 Samuel 7:24 through 27. He says, "You made Israel your very own people for all time. You, O Lord, became their God. So now, O Lord God, make this promise you have made about your servant and his family a permanent reality. Do as you promised, so you may gain lasting fame. As people say, the Lord of heaven's armies is God over Israel. The dynasty of your servant David will be established before you. For you, O Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, have told your servant, I will build you a dynastic house. That is why your servant has had the courage to pray this prayer to you." These allusions can't be all accidental. I don't think it's an accident that Isaiah repeatedly uses that specific title for the Lord and repeatedly appeals to the family of David, the house of David, the dynasty of David. Now, he doesn't come right out and say, remember the Davidic promises, your dynasty is going to last forever, so all you have to do is make sure you're faithful to the Lord because he's going to make sure the line continues. The only question is whether you get to be a part of the celebration when it does. He doesn't say that explicitly, but he doesn't need to, because we're talking about David. We're talking about one of the signature covenants of the people of Israel and one of the heroes of the people of Israel. It would be like, having one of America's most important historical figures. If someone didn't know 420, how many years ago? Now I've messed it up. Oh, that's great. It totally undermines the point I'm making, right? But it's like, what's David say when he goes out to fight the Philistine? They all would have known. They all would have known, right? Because it's a story that gets told and retold. It's one of the epic stories of the people of Israel. And so I believe Isaiah is clearly alluding to this as a reminder to encourage Ahaz, remember where you come from and remember what the Lord has promised. You're from the line of David, and it's going to continue. So why are you even worried about the Assyrians or Ephraim or any of these other countries that are going to come against you? So I believe that is the primary covenant that's sort of forming one of the foundational pieces for Isaiah in this prophecy. So, personal application. The name Lord of Heaven's Armies, as we just saw, had a significance for Israel and was used by the prophets as a means of expressing both encouragement and warning. The Lord of Heaven's armies is a great thing if you're a good servant, and it's a terrible thing if you're an enemy of the Lord. God is given many names in the Bible, and each member of the Trinity is also described differently. So, in your same groups, are there any particular names or titles that the Lord has that have been encouraging to you or caused you to learn something new or helpful about the Lord's character? He's got a lot of names, so pick one. Or just one that's your favorite. All right. Anybody want to throw out a name for God that has been significant to you? Emmanuel. It's an incredible promise of God's presence and faithfulness with us. That's a great one. Refuge, strong tower. I like those. Jessica. The Lord is my shepherd. That's a great one because it works in two ways. It reminds me that he's always faithful and watching over me, and it also reminds me that I'm a dumb sheep. So I need that sometimes. Jehovah Rapha. It's a good one. Jehovah Shammah. He is here. It's good. Anybody else want to throw one out there? Going once. Jehovah Jireh. Provider. Yeah. His wraparound presence. Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of a nice blend of like his presence everywhere, but also his personal love. That's cool. I like that. Yeah. It's amazing how many names there are for the Lord, because there are that many and more ways in which he manifests himself to us in relationship and in his actions in the world. And depending on the names that we hear, it can help remind us of those aspects of God, which is why those names were so important to the Israelites and to the prophets. Time for celebration of knowledge. Then we'll get out of here maybe on time for the first time ever, I think, perhaps. Ahaz asks the Lord for a sign to confirm Isaiah's prophecy. True or false? 5 people. Let's do this. Most people say false. That's correct. It is false. The Lord tells Ahaz to ask for a sign, and he refuses. Some commentators speculate that he was refusing because he didn't really want a sign, because he didn't really want to believe, because he'd already made up his mind. So he's couching it in the language of religion, but that it was not his actual intention to want to hear what the Lord had to say. Emmanuel means, you all got this right the first time, so we're just going to go ahead and say this is the correct one. God with us is the right answer. And then finally, the primary covenant that Isaiah seems to draw on in chapters 7 through 12 is, I'm hoping for 100% on this one. Yes. It'd be sad if we were missing that one. It is the Davidic covenant. That is correct. Personal study goal. I can never get this slide right. Every week I've gotten this slide wrong in at least one way. Personal study goal is not about the covenants. It's just read Isaiah 13 through 23. One day I will get every slide correct, but today is not that day. So read Isaiah 13 through 23. We will talk about those 10 chapters next time. Have a good night.